Imagine being imprisoned for 27 years, not for murder, not for theft, but for believing that all human beings deserve to be free. Imagine a country where the color of your skin determined where you could live, who you could love, what job you could hold, and whether you could even walk freely on the streets of the land where you were born. For nearly 5 decades, South Africa became one of the world's most oppressive regimes, a nation built on the violent separation of races, enforced by laws so cruel they shocked the conscience of humanity. But this is not just a story of oppression. This is the story of one of history's greatest liberation movements, a decades-long struggle that would produce heroes, martyrs, underground networks, mass protests, international boycotts, and ultimately, victory. This is the story of how ordinary people fought an extraordinary evil. This is the story of the Anti-Apartheid Movement. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. Today we uncover the full story of South Africa's Anti-Apartheid Movement, a struggle that lasted nearly 50 years and changed the course of a nation. In this documentary, we will take you through the complete history of apartheid, from its origins in colonial racism to its institutionalization in 1948, through the dark years of brutal repression, the rise of resistance movements, the international campaign to isolate South Africa, and finally, the miraculous transition to democracy in 1994. You will meet the leaders who risked everything. Nelson Mandela, the lawyer turned revolutionary who became the world's most famous political prisoner. Steve Biko, the brilliant young activist who created the Black Consciousness movement. Oliver Tambo, who led the struggle from exile. Winnie Mandela, who kept the resistance alive while her husband was imprisoned. You will witness the Sharpeville Massacre, the Soweto Uprising, the state of emergency, and the secret negotiations that nearly collapsed before they could succeed. But most importantly, you will understand how millions of ordinary South Africans, workers, students, clergy, musicians, and mothers stood up against one of the 20th century's most brutal systems and won. This is their story. This is history that must never be forgotten. To understand apartheid, we must first understand South Africa's colonial history. The roots of racial segregation in South Africa go back centuries, long before apartheid had a name. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope. Dutch settlers, known as Boers or Afrikaners, began claiming African land, displacing the indigenous Khoisan peoples and importing enslaved people from other parts of Africa and Asia. When the British took control of the Cape Colony in 1806, they continued policies of racial discrimination. As European settlers pushed inland, they encountered powerful African kingdoms, the Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, and others, resulting in decades of frontier wars. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 transformed South Africa from a colonial backwater into an economic powerhouse. But this wealth was built on the backs of African miners who were forced into a system of migrant labor, pass laws, and segregated compounds. By the early 20th century, a complex system of racial segregation was already in place. The 1913 Natives Land Act restricted African ownership to just 7% of South Africa's land, despite Africans making up nearly 80% of the population. Africans were required to carry passes to travel, were restricted to certain areas, and were denied political rights. The foundations of apartheid were being laid brick by brick. In response, educated Africans formed the South African Native National Congress in 1912, later renamed the African National Congress, or ANC. This organization would become the leading force in the liberation struggle. World War II changed everything. Over 120,000 black South Africans served in the war effort, fighting against Nazi racism in Europe. When they returned home, they expected recognition and rights. Instead, they found the same discrimination. Across Africa and Asia, colonized peoples were demanding independence. India gained freedom in 1947. African nations would soon follow. A wave of anti-colonial sentiment was sweeping the world. But in South Africa, the opposite happened. In 1948, the National Party, dominated by Afrikaner nationalists, won South Africa's whites-only election. Their campaign promise was simple but chilling. Apartheid, meaning apartness in Afrikaans. The new government immediately began passing laws to codify racial separation into every aspect of South African life. This wasn't just discrimination. This was a comprehensive social engineering project designed to create a white supremacist state. The Population Registration Act of 1950 classified every South African by race: white, black, colored, or Indian. Families were torn apart when members were classified differently. The infamous pencil test, where a pencil was placed in someone's hair, determined racial status based on care pattern. The Group Areas Act forced racial groups into separate residential areas, destroying vibrant mixed-race neighborhoods and relocating millions of Africans to impoverished townships far from city centers. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act segregated all public facilities: beaches, buses, hospitals, schools, parks, even park benches. Everything was separate and nothing was equal. The Bantu Education Act created a deliberately inferior education system for Africans, designed to prepare them only for menial labor. As the architect of this law, Hendrik Verwoerd stated, "There is no place for the African in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor." Perhaps the most audacious aspect of apartheid was the creation of homelands or Bantustans, 10 poverty-stricken territories carved out of the least productive land where Africans were supposedly citizens of separate nations. This fiction allowed the government to strip millions of Africans of South African citizenship, claiming they belonged to these artificial countries. In reality, these homelands had no economic viability and served only to provide cheap labor to white-owned industries. African men were forced to live in single-sex hostels near cities, separated from their families for 11 months of the year. Women and children remained in their homelands, surviving on meager remittances. Apartheid didn't just segregate races, it destroyed African family structures. As apartheid was being institutionalized, the world was moving in the opposite direction. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. Decolonization was accelerating. The global community was watching South Africa with growing horror, but the South African government had powerful allies. During the Cold War, Western powers saw apartheid South Africa as a strategic partner against communism. This support would allow the regime to survive for decades. The stage was set for confrontation. Born in 1918 in the rural Transkei, Nelson Mandela came from the Thembu royal family. He studied law at the University of Fort Hare and the University of Witwatersrand, becoming one of South Africa's first black lawyers. In 1952, Mandela opened South Africa's first black law firm with his partner, Oliver Tambo. They defended victims of apartheid laws and became deeply involved in ANC activism. Mandela was charismatic, physically imposing, and fearless. He rejected the older generation's patient petitioning approach. He wanted mass action, boycotts, strikes, and direct confrontation. Oliver Tambo, Mandela's law partner and closest friend, was quieter but equally determined. A deeply religious man and brilliant strategist, Tambo would spend 30 years in exile, building international support and keeping the ANC alive when it seemed all was lost. Walter Sisulu was the organizational genius behind the ANC's mass mobilization. As the organization's Secretary General, he recruited both Mandela and Tambo. He was the bridge between the older conservative leadership and the radical young lions demanding action. Chief Albert Luthuli, a Zulu chief and teacher, led the ANC from 1952 to 1967. A committed Christian and advocate of non-violence, Luthuli won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1960, bringing international attention to the struggle. Despite his moderate methods, the government placed him under house arrest for the last years of his life. Steve Biko emerged in the late 1960s as the voice of a new generation. A medical student and brilliant thinker, Biko founded the Black Consciousness Movement, which rejected white liberal involvement in liberation politics and emphasized psychological liberation and black pride. Biko argued that before political freedom could be achieved, Black South Africans needed to free themselves mentally from the internalized racism of apartheid. His philosophy inspired thousands of students and workers. Winnie Madikizela married Nelson Mandela in 1958, just as the struggle was intensifying. When her husband was imprisoned in 1962, she became the public face of resistance, enduring harassment, imprisonment, torture, and banishment. Controversial and defiant, Winnie kept the Mandela name and the liberation struggle in the public consciousness during the darkest years of apartheid. The African National Congress, founded in 1912, was the oldest liberation movement. Multiracial and committed initially to non-violent protest, it would be forced underground and into armed struggle. The Pan-Africanist Congress, formed in 1959 by Robert Sobukwe, broke from the ANC, advocating for exclusive African leadership and more militant tactics. The PASSI's Africa for Africans philosophy appealed to those frustrated with the ANC's multiracial approach. The Black Consciousness Movement, though not a formal political party, mobilized students and workers in the 1970s, filling the leadership vacuum after the ANC and PAC were banned. The South African Communist Party, founded in 1921, allied with the ANC and provided crucial organizational expertise and connections to international socialist movements. Many ANC leaders, including Joe Slovo and Ruth First, were communists, a fact the apartheid government used to justify repression by claiming the liberation movement was Soviet-controlled. Trade unions, particularly the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, formed the backbone of mass resistance, organizing strikes and boycotts that crippled the economy. Our religious leaders played a crucial role. Archbishop Desmond Tutu became an international spokesperson for the movement, using his moral authority and Nobel Peace Prize to pressure governments worldwide. Christian churches provided sanctuary, resources, and moral legitimacy to the struggle. Not all whites supported apartheid. Helen Suzman, a member of parliament, was a lone voice opposing apartheid laws for 13 years. Organizations like the Black Sash, white women who held silent protests, and individuals like journalist Donald Woods and lawyer Bram Fisher risked everything to oppose the system. Their courage proved that apartheid was not about culture or tradition, it was about power and greed. The 1950s began with organized mass resistance. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, the first large-scale non-violent civil disobedience movement. Volunteers deliberately violated apartheid laws, entering whites-only facilities, breaking curfews, and burning their passbooks. Over 8,000 activists were arrested, including Mandela. The campaign demonstrated that Africans would not accept apartheid passively. In 1955, nearly 3,000 delegates gathered at Kliptown for the Congress of the People, adopting the Freedom Charter, a visionary document declaring South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. The charter became the ANC's guiding principles, but the government responded by arresting 156 leaders, charging them with high treason. The treason trial would drag on for 5 years, tying up the leadership but ultimately failing to secure convictions. March 21st, 1960 changed everything. In the township of Sharpeville, the Pasi organized a protest against past laws. Thousands of Africans marched peacefully to the police station, offering themselves for arrest. Without warning, police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. 69 people were killed, most shot in the back as they fled. Over 180 were wounded. The Sharpeville massacre shocked the world. International condemnation was swift. The United Nations Security Council intervened for the first time. South Africa was becoming a pariah state. The South African government responded not with reform but with repression. The ANC and PAC were banned. Leaders went underground or into exile. Decades of peaceful protest had achieved nothing but bloodshed. The leadership faced a terrible choice: continue non-violent resistance and watch their people be massacred, or take up arms. They chose armed struggle. In 1961, Mandela and the ANC formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, an armed wing that would conduct sabotage against government installations, carefully avoiding civilian casualties. Mandela traveled secretly across Africa, receiving military training and seeking support. The press dubbed him the Black Pimpernel for his ability to evade capture. But in 1962, Mandela was captured and sentenced to 5 years for incitement. Then in 1963, police raided the ANC's underground headquarters at Rivonia Farm, arresting the entire higher command. The Rivonia trial began in 1963. Mandela and 7 others faced charges of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government, crimes punishable by death. On April 20th, 1964, Mandela delivered one of history's great courtroom speeches, concluding with the words that would echo through history. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The world held its breath. International pressure prevented execution, but the 8 defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a bleak rock in the Atlantic Ocean, where political prisoners were held in brutal conditions. He would spend 18 of his 27 years there breaking rocks in a limestone quarry. For the next decade, the liberation movement appeared crushed. Leaders were imprisoned, exiled, or dead. The government seemed invincible, but the struggle was far from over. While Mandela languished in prison, a new generation was rising. In the 1970s, Steve Biko's Black Consciousness movement inspired thousands of students to reject a psychological oppression and claim their dignity. On June 16, 1976, students in Soweto Township organized a peaceful march to protest inferior education and the requirement to learn Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor. Police responded with bullets. 13-year-old Hector Peterson was among the first killed. his dying image captured in a photograph that horrified the world. What began as a student protest exploded into a nationwide uprising. For months, townships burned. Hundreds were killed as police and military forces attempted to restore order. In September 1977, Steve Biko was detained by police. After days of torture, he died from brain injuries. He was 30 years old. The government claimed he died from a hunger strike. An autopsy revealed massive head trauma. Biko's death created international outrage and became a rallying cry. The death of Biko has united Black South Africa. By the 1980s, Prime Minister P.W. Botha's government adopted a total strategy to combat what they called a total onslaught by communist forces. This meant increased militarization, regional destabilization, and violent repression at home. South Africa invaded neighboring countries, supporting rebel groups to destabilize African governments that hosted ANC exiles. Inside South Africa, the state of emergency gave security forces unlimited powers to detain, torture, and kill. But resistance intensified. In 1983, the United Democratic Front was formed, a coalition of hundreds of civic organizations, trade unions, student groups, and religious bodies. The UDF mobilized millions in the largest mass movement South Africa had ever seen. Internationally, the Anti-Apartheid Movement gained unprecedented momentum. The Free Nelson Mandela campaign made his name known worldwide. Artists like Peter Gabriel and Bob Dylan wrote songs. Athletes boycotted South African sports. Economic sanctions began to bite. In 1988, a Free Nelson Mandela concert at Wembley Stadium reached an audience of 600 million people worldwide. Apartheid South Africa was isolated and under siege. By the late 1980s, South Africa was ungovernable. Townships were in permanent revolt. The economy was collapsing under sanctions. White conscripts were refusing military service. Even within the Afrikaner establishment, some recognized that apartheid could not survive. In 1989, P.W. Botha suffered a stroke and was replaced by F.W. de Klerk, a man who understood that negotiation was the only path forward. On February 2nd, 1990, de Klerk shocked South Africa and the world by announcing that Nelson Mandela would be released. The ANC and other liberation movements would be unbanned and negotiations would begin. 9 days later, on February 11th, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked free after 27 years in prison. The world watched as the 71-year-old man emerged, raised his fist, and addressed the nation. Instead of bitterness, he spoke of reconciliation. Instead of revenge, he called for peace. The next 4 years were tumultuous. Secret negotiations took place while violence raged in the townships. Right-wing white groups plotted coups. Elements within the security forces fomented black-on-black violence, hoping to derail the process. There were moments when everything almost collapsed. The assassination of Chris Hani, the popular Communist Party leader, nearly triggered a civil war. But Mandela's moral authority held the country together. In April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Millions of Africans voted for the first time in their lives, standing in lines that stretched for miles. On May 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president. Apartheid was dead. Now that you know the main story, let's explore the hidden dimensions of the anti-apartheid movement, the forgotten heroes, the secret operations, the myths, and the uncomfortable truths. History often focuses on male leaders, but women were the backbone of resistance. In 1956, 20,000 women marched on the Union buildings in Pretoria to protest past laws, singing, "Now you have touched the women, you have struck a rock." women like Lillian Ngoyi, Ellen Joseph, and Albertina Sisulu organized, mobilized, and kept communities together when men were imprisoned or killed. They faced unique brutality. Sexual violence was used systematically as a weapon of repression. Few know about the elaborate underground networks that smuggled activists out of South Africa for military training or safety. Routes ran through Swaziland, Botswana, Lesotho, and Mozambique. Safe houses, false documents, and courageous couriers, many of them women, operated for decades, moving people and weapons under the noses of South Africa's feared security services. In the late 1980s, the ANC launched Operation Vula, a highly secret project to infiltrate senior leadership back into South Africa to prepare for armed uprising if negotiations failed. Using sophisticated encryption technology and clandestine networks, Mac Maharaj and others established communication with Mandela in prison and prepared for final confrontation. The operation was only revealed after the transition began. An uncomfortable truth: apartheid could not have survived without African collaboration. The Bantustan leaders, tribal authorities, and black police officers served the system, often brutally enforcing apartheid laws in their own communities. Were they traitors or victims? This question still divides South African society. The system offered poverty or collaboration. Many chose survival. The liberation movement was not unified or always noble. Factions fought violently. In exile, there were purges, executions of suspected spies, and brutal discipline in military camps. The necklacing of suspected informers, placing a gasoline-filled tire around someone's neck and setting it alight, horrified the world. Winnie Mandela infamously endorsed this method, saying, "With our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country." The ANC officially condemned these actions, but they revealed the desperation and brutality that decades of oppression had created. In the final years, mysterious violence erupted between ANC supporters and the Inkatha Freedom Party, a Zulu nationalist group. Thousands died in what appeared to be ethnic conflict. Later investigations revealed the third force, elements within South Africa's security forces deliberately arming and provoking violence to destabilize negotiations. This state-sponsored terrorism nearly derailed the transition to democracy. While the world condemned apartheid publicly, Western governments and corporations sustained it privately. Britain, the United States, and Israel maintained military and economic ties throughout the struggle. Shell, British Petroleum, and IBM profited from apartheid. The International Monetary Fund extended loans. Major banks financed the regime. When sanctions finally came, they came late, only when the regime was already collapsing. Not all Afrikaners supported reform. Organizations like the Afrikaner Weerstands Beweging, AWB, plotted armed resistance. In 1993, white supremacists stormed the World Trade Center where negotiations were taking place, smashing through the glass facade with an armored vehicle. Bomb attacks, assassination plots, and plans for a white homeland continued until the last moment. The transition to democracy was far closer to civil war than many realize. What about Mandela's military training? Few discuss that Nelson Mandela received military training in Ethiopia and Algeria. He studied guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and revolutionary theory. He was not just a peaceful icon. He was a trained revolutionary who authorized armed struggle. This complexity is often sanitized in popular memory, but it reveals the impossible choices apartheid forced on those who opposed it. Against all odds, South Africa avoided the bloodbath that everyone predicted. The transition from apartheid to democracy without full-scale civil war remains one of history's miracles. Credit belongs to leaders on both sides who chose negotiation over annihilation, but mostly to millions of ordinary South Africans who chose hope over hatred. Instead of Nuremberg-style trials, South Africa created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Perpetrators could confess their crimes publicly and receive amnesty in exchange for truth. For 2 years, South Africans confronted their past. Victims faced their torturers. Police confessed to murders. The nation wept together. It was imperfect. Many felt justice was denied, but it prevented the cycle of revenge that destroyed other post-conflict societies. Today, South Africa has one of the world's most progressive constitutions, protecting rights that many nations still deny. It has a free press, independent judiciary, and vibrant democracy. But the legacy of apartheid endures. Economic inequality remains extreme. South Africa is one of the world's most unequal societies. Most wealth is still in white hands. Black South Africans face poverty rates over 50%. Education and healthcare are failing the majority. Unemployment exceeds 30%. Violence and crime are endemic. The land question remains unresolved. Apartheid stole African land, but the negotiated settlement protected property rights. Today, white South Africans, less than 8% of the population, own over 70% of agricultural land. Calls for land redistribution without compensation have created tension, raising questions about whether political freedom without economic justice is meaningful. The anti-apartheid movement transformed global activism. It proved that sustained international pressure, sanctions, boycotts, divestment could defeat even powerful regimes. The strategies developed against apartheid influenced movements worldwide. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israeli occupation, climate activism, and campaigns against authoritarian regimes all learned from the anti-apartheid playbook. The South African struggle taught crucial lessons. Liberation requires both mass mobilization and international solidarity. It requires moral clarity combined with strategic flexibility. It requires unified leadership despite ideological differences. Most importantly, it taught that liberation is not an event, but a process. Political freedom is just the beginning, not the end. Today, South Africans fight over the meaning of the struggle. Who were the real heroes? Was armed struggle justified? Should collaborators be forgiven? How should Afrikaners remember this history? Museums, monuments, and commemorations become battlegrounds where different communities contest the past. Nelson Mandela has been transformed into a global saint, a symbol of forgiveness and reconciliation. World leaders who once condemned him now invoke his name. But this sanitization erases his complexity. Mandela was a revolutionary who authorized violence. He was a politician who made compromises many found unacceptable. He was a flawed human who made mistakes. Understanding Mandela fully means accepting this complexity, celebrating his achievements, while acknowledging that liberation requires more than one hero. Many activists argue the revolution remains incomplete. Political apartheid is dead, but economic apartheid survives. The struggle continues, not against white supremacist laws, but against inequality, poverty, and corruption. The next generation of activists, particularly student movements like Fees Must Fall, see themselves as continuing the liberation struggle their parents began. So what is the ultimate lesson of the anti-apartheid movement? First, it teaches us that injustice, no matter how powerful or institutionalized, is not eternal. Apartheid seemed invincible. The regime had nuclear weapons, a massive military, and support from Western powers. Yet it fell, brought down not by armies, but by the refusal of ordinary people to accept oppression. Second, it teaches us that liberation is collective. We celebrate Mandela, but he would be the first to say that the struggle was won by millions whose names we will never know. The domestic workers who joined strikes, the students who faced bullets, the exiles who spent decades away from home, the prisoners who refused to break. Third, it teaches us about the price of freedom. The anti-apartheid movement cost tens of thousands of lives. If families were destroyed, entire generations grew up in conflict. The psychological and economic damage will take generations to heal. Freedom is never free. It is purchased with sacrifice, courage, and blood. Fourth, it teaches us that winning is not enough. The ANC won political power but struggled to translate that into economic transformation. Liberation movements often become the new elite, forgetting the masses who put them in power. The challenge for any society emerging from oppression is to remain true to the values that inspired the struggle. Fifth, it teaches us about forgiveness without forgetting. South Africa chose reconciliation over revenge, but this does not mean amnesia. The past must be remembered, acknowledged, and learned from, or else it will repeat. Sixth, it teaches us that oppression creates solidarity. The anti-apartheid movement united people across race, class, religion, and nationality. Black and white, Christian and Muslim, communist and capitalist all recognized apartheid as an affront to human dignity. When we face injustice today, we must build the same coalitions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the anti-apartheid movement teaches us about the power of hope. For 50 years, victory seemed impossible. Leaders died, movements were crushed, international support wavered, but hope persisted. The belief that another world is possible sustained the struggle through the darkest moments. In our own time, when injustice seems overwhelming, when powerful systems seem unchangeable, when cynicism threatens to paralyze us, we must remember South Africa. We must remember that ordinary people, armed with nothing but courage and conviction, toppled one of the 20th century's most brutal regimes. The story of the anti-apartheid movement is ultimately a story about human dignity, about the refusal to accept that some people are worth more than others because of the color of their skin. It is a story about the long arc of history bending toward justice, not automatically, not easily, but because people bent it through decades of sacrifice and struggle. It is a reminder that we are not powerless, that every generation inherits injustice and has the choice to perpetuate it or challenge it. The South Africans who fought apartheid chose to challenge it. They won. Their victory belongs to all of us. Their unfinished work calls to all of us. Thank you for watching this episode of Africa Hidden History. The story of the anti-apartheid movement reminds us that African history is not just about colonialism and oppression. It is also about resistance, resilience, and triumph. The men and women who fought apartheid were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because injustice demanded a response. Their courage, their sacrifice, and their ultimate victory should inspire all of us to confront the injustices we see in our own time. If this documentary moved you, please like this video, subscribe to Africa Hidden History, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. History is not just about the past, it is about understanding who we are and imagining who we can become. In the comments, tell us, what aspect of the anti-apartheid movement inspired you most? What lessons from this struggle are relevant to today's challenges? Until then, remember, our history is our power. Know it. Share it. Let it guide us toward a better future. This is Africa Hidden History. Thank you for watching.